I'd like to share with you all something I never thought I would ever have to say in the course of my ministry. Sure is hard to follow Elmo. But we're so happy that you're here this morning, that you've decided to join us as we're taking this Lenten journey through the cross, the empty tomb, and the joy of living as resurrected people. And throughout this journey, the weeks leading up to Easter, our guide has been the disciple Peter. And you might know this already, but we love the disciple Peter for a lot of different reasons. He's often the first to speak up. He's often the first to act. He is bold for Christ, and he fails boldly. And all throughout Peter's journey, we've seen how he's navigated different situations that come up because of his discipleship. And this week, we're going to see how he stewards a gift that Jesus offers him on this new journey, and how we're invited to do that as well. Now, last Tuesday, we were gathering together for our Lenten Bible study, and we were chatting just before the study got started, and I was sharing with a few of the folks there that two of my siblings went from high school to play collegiate sports. And one wonderful woman asked me, and Anne-Marie, what was your sport? And I proudly responded, the bench. But when I was in high school, I loved theater and music and speech and debate because I'm really cool. And one summer, over the break, I got a job working at a music studio. And I assisted in a week-long camp for kids. And at the end of the week, they put on a shortened version of the musical Frozen. And so I was in high school, I was very excited, the movie was very popular, and I had gotten another one of my friends to sign up to do this camp with me, and we couldn't wait to work backstage, to get all the pieces together. It was going to be so fun. Until we got there, and it turns out I wasn't helping backstage at this camp, I was running this camp. My friend left immediately. Because we had been given this assignment that we didn't even know how to do, let alone do well. And it turns out that, not just backstage, but the set, the script, the casting, all the activities except for snack and choreography, I was in charge of as a 16-year-old. And God's still giving me grace for what happened that week. We made it through. Not even one kid was maimed. We did a great job. And of course, the kids' performance was adorable. They worked really hard. They saw it through. It was beautiful. I learned a super valuable lesson. There is nothing that snow cones can't fix. No, the real lesson that I learned is that, of course, throughout the course of our life, especially in our life of faith, we are given situations and callings and gifts that we are not always well prepared for. That God is going to entrust things to us that we don't always know how to steward well. And so what do we do in the midst of that? How do we respond? Especially when our wandering hearts lead us to places that we don't necessarily want to go. That's what we find in our text this morning. Peter is given this situation by Christ, and he tells him how to respond. So we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew this morning, chapter 18, verses 15 through 23. And this is what it says. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If you are listened to, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If that person refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen, even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but truly I tell you, 77 times. So throughout our course of our Lenten journey, this Wandering Heart series, each text is paired with a line from the song, Come Thou Fount. And the line for this week is teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming courts above. And the Gospel of Matthew is often called the teacher's gospel, because throughout it there are spaces of direct teaching that Jesus offers to his disciples or the crowds. So throughout Matthew, we have 5 different, just direct teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, the missionary discourse, the parable discourse, all about the kingdom of God, the community discourse, where we are today, and the apocalyptic discourse of the things to come. Now you can all pass your test on the Gospel of Matthew. Congratulations. But in chapter 18, where we are this morning, it's called the community discourse. And Peter, this no one, this fisherman, has been brought into the fellowship of Christ as a follower, a disciple. And a few weeks ago, he was raised up as the rock on whom Christ would build the church. And now, Jesus is preparing Peter and these disciples to actually have that church, to live in community. And he gives them various ways of understanding how they live and work together, and right in the middle, he offers them the text that we read this morning. Because like us, Peter has been given a gift. The gift of the church, the gift of community, the gift of one another. That gift of life constantly in relationship. And like us, Peter and those around him and those to come after him will not always steward that gift well. A few years ago, Leighton and I were serving in youth ministry at a United Methodist church in Waco. And it was one of the hardest seasons of ministry I've ever been in. Because right in the middle of our time there was a really nasty split in the church. A pastor left and started their own church. They took a lot of the staff members with them. And it was a really hard season on the students that we were working with, on the parents, on the families who had helped create that church. And so that Saturday, that all of those news came out, I got a call from one of the associate pastors who was still trying to make sure every piece was in place for Sunday morning worship. So she called and asked me to do a different job than I usually do to make sure that everything was filled. And she asked, how was I feeling? I was not feeling great. I told her the truth. I told her that I felt like my friends had broken trust with me. Like our sacred community had been hurt. And that I didn't know if we were going to be okay. And I'll never forget what she said back to me. She said, I kind of think the church shouldn't exist. Not what I thought she was going to say. But she said, we can be so poor at being with one another well. Jesus left us this precious creation in the hands of people, all of us, who are sometimes just not that worthy of it. And then she said, but the church has existed for 2,000 years, and it'll exist long after us, because it doesn't really belong to us. It belongs to Christ. And the same is true of that community that Christ is leaving Peter. Jesus instructs them for instructions for when they hurt one another. And as part of our discipleship, we're given this gift of community, that we're meant to travel in faith together. As part of how we're made, God invites us to live in relationship constantly with God, with one another. But we're also bound to be guilty of not stewarding that well. We hurt one another. We hurt our community. We hurt ourselves. We often fall short of being with one another well. And so Jesus, in this community discourse, walks them through how do we approach these pains? And now these instructions are made for sins that affected the entire church. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about families being unfaithful to one another, or how some members were taking others to court and suing them. And in gathering for communion, how some members wouldn't wait for everyone to arrive. And so they would partake in communion, some would have plenty to eat, and others would have none. And so he gives these instructions about going to the person who has committed the offense in private, trying to work it out, and then going with them with a few people who can make sure there's mediation and no misunderstanding, and then going in front of the church, which is not like this, but a group of maybe 20 or 30 people who met in church homes, who knew each other well, who cared about one another. And he uses this Jewish rabbinic language of binding and loosing as a reminder that we are given the authority to say when there's grace for an instruction for God, where we need to loose it, like Christ does when he talks about the Sabbath, and when we need to follow the letter of the law, when we need to bind it, like Christ talks about when we love God and love our neighbor. And this process is meant to preserve the dignity and respect and well-being of those who are in pain and inflicting pain, but also to protect the church community so that it can be that place that demonstrates God's love as best as it can. So this model is meant to be for a small house church around the first century. But Christ also offers it to our own lives. How do we approach personal relationships in the midst of offense or pain? How do we aim to preserve the other's dignity and respect? Are we doing our best to have clear and mediated conversations? Are we working toward reconciliation at every turn? Friends, we all know there's times when that's not possible, that there are journeys that we have to go on when we have to part from one another, that there are times that the holy and healthy choice is separation even when we wish it wasn't. But Jesus says in that perfect world, treat those you have to separate from like a Gentile or a tax collector, which for Jewish people would mean people on the outcasts, folks they maybe wanted nothing to do with. But how did Jesus treat Gentiles and tax collectors? We find over and over that Jesus is judged not because he turns them away, but because he invites them in. That he offers that love and grace and ways back. But these are perfect situations. And we know the truth of our lives are often messy. Not yours, just mine. But when and where we can, Christ says that we've been given this gift of community, that we might not always steward it well, but that we're called into it anyway, that we are made for life in relationship, that we will fail at being with one another well, but we're called to be for one another anyway. At the end of this text, Peter asks about forgiveness. Jesus shares this famous line that we're called not to forgive 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7. To be honest with y'all, I think what Peter is offering is really generous. Someone who can forgive 7 times, and there's no mention of apology or any sort of amends. 7 times? But how does Jesus respond? He reminds us that it's not about enough times that we're called to forgive, but that we're called to a lifestyle of community. And that will mean demonstrating what reconciliation looks like for the world. Lauren Wright Pittman put together a work of art based on this text. And I'd like to read for you all how she describes it. She says, in this mandala, I want to follow a person through the process of reproval, forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration, as Jesus describes in Matthew 18. In the center, a person is standing alone, isolated with their arms crossed in a closed-off posture. If you're sinned against, Jesus says, to go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. When you move to the second ring of the mandala, there are pairs of people shaking hands, finding common ground, or at least attempting to. If this doesn't work, then you are to bring more people, one or two more, together to provide counsel and witness. In the third ring of the mandala, two people are engaging with a closed-off person, sharing a way forward. In the next ring, hyacinth flowers, which represent sorrow, regret, and forgiveness, stretch, bloom, and grow, bringing beauty into the now open arms of the people in the last ring of the mandala, who are embracing and woven into the community. The person from the center goes from being alone and closed off to embraced and open. She writes, when I was drawing the figures from the center out, it began to look like a dance. Is this not the picture that grace paints? Forgiveness cannot happen in isolation, and certainly neither can reconciliation nor restoration. The movement toward wholeness is the movement toward one another. I love this work that she put together, that she wove through the text, the patterns that we have of ways back to one another. But I think there might be a piece of art that demonstrates who we are called to be as the church, this living relationship that happens not just here, but wherever we go. We are the church. What that looks like for the world. It's called kintsugi. You all may have heard of this before. Kintsugi is a Japanese form of art that takes into account brokenness, but it doesn't leave it that way. And the idea is very simple. If there's a piece of pottery that's broken, you have a choice. You can put it together like new, or you can pivot. Instead of trying to make it like new, you can make something new entirely. Rather than trying to patch it up and pretend those cracks don't exist, kintsugi embraces them. Instead of trying to hide where that brokenness has been, it outlines each crack with gold. And now this thing that was made broken is made all the more beautiful by coming together again. Not to hide where it had been shattered, but to highlight it. And the same is true of us as people of faith, as people who follow Christ. This entire text is surrounded by stories Jesus tells about how far God goes to embrace each of us. The story of the 99 sheep left at home for the shepherd to go and find the one. The story of a king who forgives a debt that his debtor could never pay. And the question that Peter asks is the same one that we do. How do we live in response to this kind of grace? In our own lives full of all kinds of relationships. Beautiful, broken, messy. We know that every once in a while, we can't find ways back to each other. That we can leave things at the throne of grace of God. But every once in a while, our brokenness, our pain, can be reconciled, can be forgiven, can be outlined in gold. And in these moments, we reflect to the world what it means to be offered a grace that we cannot explain. That we have been given a gift that we don't deserve. But that God can make something beautiful out of it anyway. May it ever be so.